But anyway, that was the way I felt about it. And the fact that my sobriety has been maintained continuously for 13 and a half years doesn't allow me to think that I'm necessarily any farther away from my next drink than any of you people here. I'm still very human, and I still think a double of scotch would taste awful good. And if it didn't produce disastrous results, I might do it. I don't know. I really love scotch. But I have no reason to think that it would taste any differently. I have no legitimate reason to believe that the results would be any different. They were always the same. They were always the same in that I always wound up back of the dear old 8-ball somewhere. And I have no precedent or anything to make it feel legitimate for me to believe that the results today would be any different than they were 14 and 20 and 25 and 30 years ago when I did the same thing. I just don't want to pay that bill, because that's a big bill. It always was, and I think it would be even larger today, because with what has gone on in the last 15 years, and naturally being a bit out of practice, I don't believe I'd really last very long, and I'm having an awful nice time. And I just don't want to bump myself off, even with the pleasures of the alcohol route. So I'm not going to do it. And I'm never going to do it as long as I do the things that I'm supposed to do. And I know what those things are. So if I should ever get tired, I certainly never would have anyone to blame for it. It would be done, perhaps not with malice aforethought, but it certainly would be done with, as the result at least, of extreme carelessness and indifference. I said I was quite human, and I get to thinking every once in a while, well, here's this Smith guy, he's a fairly smart individual. He's got this liquor situation right for the tail, proved it, demonstrated it, hadn't had a drink for 13 years. Probably could knock off a couple and no one would be the wiser. No, I'm telling you, I'm not trying to be funny at all, because those thoughts actually enter my mind. And I know just the minute they do exactly what has happened. You see, there in Akron, we have the extreme good fortune, as a great many of you people know, of having a very nice hospital set up at St. Thomas Hospital, with a ward that theoretically accommodates 7, but good Sister Ignatia sees that it's stretched a little bit, and she usually has about 2 or 3 more parked around somewhere. And I almost invariably, I find that I haven't been paying quite so much attention to the boys in the ward as I should. Just as sure as that idea that I could probably polish off a couple enters my mind, I think, how about the boys in the ward? You've been giving them the semi-brush off here for a few days. You better get back on the job, big boy, before you get into trouble. And I pat her right back and am much more attentive than I had been in the days preceding the time that I got this funny idea. But I get it, and I get it every once in a while, and I'll probably continue to get it as long or whenever I get careless about that one thing. You know, back in those early days about which I spoke, before we had the 12 steps, we did have some other things. beside the actual biblical verses. That was. I was getting to thinking more of Smith than I was the ward. Otherwise, I wouldn't have neglected him. And I wasn't being especially loving. When these fellows had come there, indicating their desire for help, and I was just a little too busy to give them any, or at least very much, of my time. Don't want to be bothered with the bird. 10 cents to get rid of him, well, that's easy. You could even stand 2 bits. But not because you love the fellow, but just to be relieved of the nuisance of his hanging on your coat sleeve or what have you. No unselfishness, no love indicated in the transaction at all. But I think that the thing that really counts is really giving a service of yourself, and that almost invariably, not always, but almost invariably requires some effort and some time of your own. It isn't a matter of putting a little quiet money in the dish. That helps, and possibly that's indicated too. But that isn't giving much. That is for the average individual in days like this when most people get along at least fairly well. That type of giving I don't believe would ever keep anyone sober or anywhere near it. But giving of his own effort and strength and time is quite a different matter. And I think that's what is meant by, and what was meant by what Bill learned in New York that I didn't get in Akron. The matter of those 4 absolutes, we call them, the only yardsticks we had in the early days, I think they still hold good. And I still think that they can be extremely helpful. I have found at times that questions arise, and I want to do the right thing, but the answers are not obvious. You don't know what the right thing is. But almost always, if you check it into it carefully, by the yardsticks of absolute honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, and whatever your decision is, checks up pretty well with those 4, your answer can't be very far out of the way. If, however, you do that, as I have done at times, and still am not too satisfied with the answer, I usually consult some friend whose judgment perhaps I think in this particular case would be very much better than mine. But usually you can do it yourself without bothering your friends about your own personal decisions in overcoming the first step. You can't quite get honest enough to admit that John Barleycorn really has bested us. The matter of absolute purity is somewhat like it. It's purity of ideas and purity of motives and what have you. Non-selfishness includes those things that I've just been talking about. Not the dime or the 2 bits to the bump, but actually giving of yourself. And as you well know, the absolute love is probably a big word incorporating all 3 with a little bit more along with it. I think that that is a very difficult thing to have absolute love. I don't think any of us will ever get it. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to get it. It was extremely difficult for me, and I feel that I never have been very successful at it. It's very difficult for me to love my fellow man. I didn't dislike him, but I didn't love him. unless there was some special reason he was just, I was just indifferent toward him. I wouldn't do him any harm. I would be willing to give him a little lift if it didn't require too much effort. I never would injure him at all. But to love him, I just couldn't do it for a long time. And I think that I overcame it to some extent when I was forced to do it. Because I was either going to love this bird enough to attempt to be helpful to him, or I would probably get drunk again. You could say, well, Lord, you were just, that's just a manifestation of selfishness, which is quite correct. I was selfish to the extent of not wanting Smith hurt. So to keep from getting Smith hurt, I would attempt to go through the motions of being helpful to this other fellow. You can debate it any way you want to, but the fact still remains, for the average individual, absolute love is a thing that he will never acquire. I suspect there are a few people who do. I think maybe I know some that come pretty close to it. But I think I could count them on the fingers of one hand. I don't say that in a disparaging manner, because I have some wonderful friends. I'm talking about it in its finer aspects, and particularly as it applies to AAs. I don't think we do anything well very much in this world unless we practice it. And I don't believe we do AA work too well unless we practice it. These fellows that break world records in athletic events, people who win titles in the boxing arena, are people who practice it. They've been practicing it for years. Even though they may necessarily be endowed with a lot of physical ability and skill, they still have to practice. And we have to practice to do a good job in AA. And there are a number of things that we should practice. We should practice, as I say, acquiring the spirit of service. We should attempt to acquire some faith, which isn't always easily done, especially for the person who's always been very materialistically minded. And those are the standards of society today, beyond all doubt and peradventure. You have $1 million and your neighbor has 900 grand, you're a much better man than your neighbor to the extent of $100,000. And so forth and so on ad nauseam. But